The island of New Guinea is the second largest island in the world and contains the third largest expanse of tropical rainforest. On top of housing nearly 7% or more of the world's biodiversity and being the most pluralistically diverse region on the planet, it is also home to 1,000 or more languages. Much of the island remains undeveloped, due in part to its extreme topography. However, an area of land almost the size of the U.S. state of Rhode Island, right in the middle of the island on the border between its two nations, Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, is in danger of being razed for what was initially conceived as the world's biggest palm oil plantation. And the seemingly ever-changing investors of this project have remained secret for more than a decade. On this episode of Mongabay Explores, we unpack the findings of a multi-year investigation into exactly who is trying to destroy the heart of New Guinea. I'm Mike DiGirolamo, your host for Mongabay Explores, an episodic podcast series from Mongabay.com's global team, where I speak with experts, scientists, and activists from the field working to protect our natural world. You're listening to episode 6 in our season featuring the island of New Guinea. This stretch of land, which is home to pristine, dense primary rainforest and also indigenous territory, is the planned site of the Tanah Merah project, a roughly 2,800 square kilometer, 1,100 square mile stretch of land owned by a spate of corporations, some of them hiding their true identity through what's called shell companies. Located in the heart of New Guinea, it contains enough carbon that simply clearing it would emit the same amount of emissions as the U.S. state of Virginia burns in a year from fossil fuels. I spoke with Mongabay senior editor Philip Jacobson to discuss the twisted web of corporate secrecy shrouding its development and where it stands today. I also spoke with Bonnie Sumner, a reporter with the Aotearoa New Zealand organization, Newsroom, who met with someone who was listed as a majority shareholder of 3 concessions of this land in person. She spoke about his curiously contradictory remarks about what the project was for and just what he, or whoever he represents, plans to do with it. To call the Tanah Merah project complex would be an understatement. Over the course of 22 months, Mongabay worked with newsrooms at The Gecko Project, Tempo, Earthsite, and Malaysia Kini, who investigated the fixers, middlemen, and backdoor dealings of the project and published it all in the collaborative piece, The Secret Deal to Destroy Paradise. While the fate of the majority of the land on which the Tanah Merah project sits has yet to be sealed, many questions remain unanswered. The following is a summary of what we know.
I'm Philip Jacobson. I'm a senior editor for Southeast Asia at Mongabay, and we've been investigating this project for several years now, since 2017, and we've been following it ever since then. The story of this project starts in 2007. This is the height of the 2000s commodities boom, which drove up palm oil prices in Indonesia, and it was a time where there was a huge land rush in Indonesia. You had all these characters ranging from, large corporations to kind of shady local characters trying to get permits for palm oil plantations from local government officials. And there was a lot of money to be made in this.
In 2007, 7 permits were issued to 7 different companies. While they appear to have all been set up by the same person, it's unclear who exactly set them up. The identities of the true owners were not made public, and instead fake shareholders, people who had no idea their names had been used for a company, were listed in their place.
So what happened in 2007 was somebody set up 7 companies in Indonesia. And the head of a jurisdiction in Indonesia's Papua province, called Bovendigel District, which is where this project is located. The head of that district issued permits to all 7 of these shell companies for oil palm plantations. And these 7 permits covered 7 contiguous blocks of rainforest in Bovendigel, spanning a total of 2,800 square kilometers. So just an enormous area of land. If fully developed, this would have been the world's biggest palm oil plantation.
At 2,800 square kilometers, 1,100 square miles, the project is massive, almost twice the size of Greater London. While no one knows exactly who set these companies up, they were all established in nearly the same week, and each company had 2 different shareholders. The addresses of the companies appeared to be fake. Some didn't actually exist, and others led to locations of storefronts and people who didn't know about the project. These are what are referred to as shell companies. As for the shareholders, many of those were fake as well. The investigation revealed 2 different people listed as shareholders who, in reality, were both janitors working in banks in Jakarta who had no idea their names had been used for a company.
Interestingly, no one really knows who set those companies up or who was actually behind them, because the names of the shareholders on paper were random people. We actually tracked some of them down in Jakarta, and they told us that they were janitors in a bank, at the time that these companies were set up. So it's a total mystery who set these companies up. Regardless of that, for 3 years, nothing ever happened in these concessions. The land was not developed, and the permits were allowed to expire.
But that wouldn't remain the case for very long.
In 2010, a new player enters the scene in this project, and it's an Indonesian businessman named Chairul Anhar.
Chairul was the spokesperson for Menara, and he claimed to own the rights to develop thousands of square kilometers of land in Bovendigel.
So this guy Chairul Anhar, he presents himself as the head of this sprawling conglomerate called the Menara Group.
However, this organization barely existed on paper, having an office in Jakarta's business district, but no other projects to its name, and didn't even have a website. The first Bupati, or person in charge of a district, of Bovendigel, Yusak Yaluo, was elected in 2005 at age 35. He issued the initial permits to the first 7 companies. He met up with Chairul and another man named Desi Malvidas, and Chairul told Yusak that the Menara Group had bought the 7 shell companies.
So Chairul Anhar approaches the head of Bovendigel. He's a local politician named Yusak Yaluo. So Chairul Anhar flies to Papua on a private jet and sits down with Yusak Yaluo. He tells Yusak that the Menara Group has acquired these 7 companies with the expired permits, and he wants Yusak to extend the permits, to renew the permits. And he convinces Yusak to renew the permits. We interviewed both Yusak and Chairul.
Yusak told us in an interview that he believed that the Menara Group could make good on the promise of providing local communities with infrastructure and development that is commonly touted as being a byproduct of extractive projects, so he agreed to work with them. The project hit a snag when Yusak was arrested in 2010 for embezzlement in a separate case, and subsequently went to a top-security prison in Jakarta to be prosecuted. Corruption isn't uncommon in Indonesia. Incidents such as this are regularly investigated by the KPK, which is Indonesia's anti-corruption agency. Despite this, he was allowed to continue to campaign for a second term as Bupati while being prosecuted, and he was re-elected to another term that same year. Roughly 2 months after this, he was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, and he was officially inaugurated in March 2011. In a parliamentary compromise with the KPK, Yusak's running mate was allowed to assume the role of Bupati in his stead. But before this, while jailed 3,600 kilometers, 2,200 miles away from Bovendigel in a Javan prison cell, Yusak was still able to sign official documents since at the time he was in office, and this included signing decrees that the 7 shell companies Menara owned had completed valid environmental impact assessments, a key step in the licensing process that the companies would need to get before they could legally begin operating.
So after he issued the initial permits, he was actually arrested for corruption in a separate case. He was siphoning off money from the district budget, millions of dollars, and he actually signed subsequent permits for the Tanah Merah project from a prison cell. He was technically still in office. He was being held in prison, and he actually told us that he had signed the permits while he was, during this period.
Chirul estimated it would take $1.4 billion to convert the rainforest to oil palm plantations in the 7 concessions. He claims in an interview with us that he was having difficulty finding backers. What he eventually did was sell most of the shares in 6 of the 7 companies to outside investors.
Now you have this company, Manara Group, with no track record, and it's in control of this huge area of land. It's got no record of developing palm oil plantations. And sure enough, instead of actually trying to develop the land, Chirul Anhar proceeds to sell the rights to the project to other investors. He sells 2 of the companies with permits to a big Malaysian conglomerate. He sells 4 of the companies to anonymously owned companies in the Middle East, and no one knows who's behind those companies. And then the 7th company stays within the Manara Group.
He, or whoever he represented, made $80 million from one of those deals, which spanned 2 of the companies. It is not publicly known how much of the remaining 4 companies were sold for, but we estimated the sale of all the shares could be $311 million or more.
So, he slices and dices up the project and sells it, for tens of millions of dollars. I think Tadmax, the Malaysian conglomerate, paid $40 million for each of the 2 companies it bought. So, you have Chirul Anhar, who, just by moving some papers around, makes $80 million.
So Chirul was, in a roundabout way, selling the palm oil permits, which you cannot legally do. He circumvented that illegality by selling the shell companies that owned the permits. And this is not an unusual practice in Indonesia over the past decade and a half. When Indonesia's palm oil boom was getting off the ground in the 2000s, a huge amount of permits were issued to companies owned by brokers who never intended to develop the land, but only wanted to flip the permits onto other investors for quick profits. In some cases, politicians have placed their own relatives and associates in the position of middlemen, issuing permits to shell companies owned by people they know, like family members, who can then sell that company to a palm oil producer, netting the politicians some cash. We can be reasonably certain that this wasn't the case with the Tanah Merah project, but it has been observed in other cases. Let's take a step back and clarify something about corporate secrecy tools. First, there's nominee shareholders. At this point in the story, most of the companies listed on the Tanah Merah project are hidden using these nominees. Some of these individuals are fake, such as the janitors in Jakarta who had no knowledge of their identities being used, and some were people like Chirul's personal driver. In any case, instead of listing the name of the actual owner of a company, the company can simply nominate a shareholder in their place, and that shareholder could theoretically be anybody, even someone who has no knowledge of the company. I could nominate you as a shareholder and technically put your address down as owning a company I set up. The shell companies we've described thus far are all companies that exist inasmuch as they are names of offices and they have addresses, but not necessarily any valid operation or track record. The addresses could lead to anywhere, or in the case of the Manara Group, an office in Jakarta. Along with Chirul, 13 other individuals were listed as shareholders in the 7 shell companies that were bought by the Manara Group. But there was no clear way to tell whether Chirul truly owned these companies, was the CEO of Manara, or worked for someone else who did, and there was no way of knowing who was reaping the profit from the supposed $300 million that was made when the shares were sold. If you're confused by all this, that's understandable. But there's another tool to hide the identity of a company's owner. This is called a secrecy jurisdiction. These are places where companies can hide the identity of a shareholder, or whoever owns that company. The US state of Delaware is one of these places, and so is the Cayman Islands. A company can be set up in one of these locations and need not disclose very much public information. The true owner of a company remains anonymous. Meanwhile, this anonymously owned company could be listed as the shareholder of another legitimate company set up in another country, like Indonesia, successfully disguising the identity of whoever is really behind it. In Bovendigel, this is exactly what Chirul did.
We don't know who's behind Chirul. We don't know if Chirul's actually, keeping that money. Presumably, he's representing other people. But I guess it speaks to one of the issues raised by this project, which is, how corporate secrecy or how, various tools of corporate secrecy have been employed to conceal the true owners of this project, the people who have actually bought into it. And some of these companies are clearing forest land today, including the anonymously owned companies in Dubai. And no one knows who's benefiting from that. It could be, it could be a Russian oligarch, it could be Donald Trump, it could be president of Indonesia, for all anybody knows. I'm not saying that that's, who they are, but it could be anybody.
Now, from here is where things start to get a little complicated. That $80 million from the two companies that were sold by Chirul was paid for by a Malaysian company called Tadmax Resources, but it did not go to the shareholders of the two shell companies of which Chirul was listed as one. It instead went to, if you can believe this, two other shell companies set up in Singapore, but the shareholders of those companies were also nominees and not the true owners, and Menara says the money didn't go to them. While the deals Tadmax has made are public information, as it's listed on the Malaysian Stock Exchange, the identities of the buyers of Menara's other companies were not. Majority stakes in 4 of the other 7 shell companies were sold to yet another set of investors whose identities were concealed behind 4 anonymously owned companies in the Middle East, which you may have guessed are all in secrecy jurisdictions, like Dubai. To this day, the true owners of those companies are not known. But let's take this story back a little bit and talk about how palm oil permits are issued. The current president of Indonesia, you may know, is Joko Widodo, otherwise known as Jokowi, and he made it a point of policy to not issue any more palm oil permits and to review the existing ones, instituting a moratorium on them in 2018.
After taking office, President Jokowi declared a moratorium on the issuance of new permits for oil palm plantations and a review of all existing permits. So this was a 3-year moratorium, and it expired last September 2021. So during the 3 years, they were supposed to review all the outstanding oil palm plantation concessions around the country. And they'd previously done something similar with the mining industry, and they ended up canceling, I think it was hundreds of permits, because they had been issued illegally, or there was some irregularity in the permit, or maybe the company, wasn't paying taxes or something. So presumably that's what they were going to do with this palm oil permit review, is look at all the permits, figure out which ones were issued illegally, and cancel them. And, it's a huge, corruption is a huge issue in Indonesia. I mean, it's widely known that, many of these permits that have been issued were issued by corrupt government officials in exchange for bribes. I mean, the Indonesian government has done studies that say that. And there have been cases where district government officials have been caught in the act of taking a bribe in exchange for issuing a permit.
While very few permits were actually canceled during this moratorium, Jokowi's administration canceled dozens of forest and land lease permits in January of this year, 2022, including the 7 land lease permits of the Tanah Merah project. You might think of this as a victory for the environment and human rights, but it's not that simple.
The policy expired last September, and very, very few permits had been canceled at that time. In January of this year, 2022, the Jokowi administration did announce that it was canceling, around 200 forestry and plantation permits. And on that list of canceled forest release permits were the seven of the permits underlying the Tanah Merah project. So on the face of it, if you're, an advocate for the environment and indigenous people's rights, then, it seems like a pretty good thing. But it doesn't mean that the land's not going to be developed, because what's happened in recent years is new permits have been issued for the same area of land to new investors. So now we have these competing investors, with overlapping permits for the same area of land.
The 7 permits that were canceled are only the ones issued by the Forestry Ministry, but every company has to acquire a series of permits from multiple levels of government in addition to the ones issued by the Forest Minister. The Bupati and the provincial governor also have to sign off on it.
So each of the 7 companies has to get a series of permits to make a plantation. So what happened in January was the Forestry Ministry canceled permits that it had issued to these 7 companies, but the companies still have permits from other government agencies. So it's still unclear whether that means these companies won't be able to operate, whether they can still operate based on these other permits. That's one thing. The other thing is that over the past few years, new investors have arrived on the scene in this project. They've set up new companies and gotten new permits for the same areas of land. So for the past few years, there's been this kind of jockeying for control among these different groups of investors for control over this forest land that is included in this project. So maybe these cancellations in January got rid of one group of investors, but there's still other investors who could take advantage of that, and now they have a clear path to develop the land. And then the third thing is that even if there were no other investors, it's unclear why the Jokowi administration canceled these permits. What some observers have said is that many permits that were canceled because the developers weren't developing the land, and actually government officials have said that. And so what could happen is the government could just reissue those lands to new investors who will develop the land. So it's unclear whether the government was canceling permits in the name of conservation or because they just wanted to develop the land and current investors weren't actually operating. So let's give them to someone else. So that kind of remains to be seen, something to watch going forward.
Permits to a concession that were not canceled, but were actually part of the new slate of permits that were issued, that Phil referred to, belonged to a company of which a New Zealand businessman was, until very recently, listed as the majority shareholder. If you'll remember earlier when I mentioned the company Tadmax, which bought land from Chirul, well, another company named Diggle Agri acquired permits to develop those same lands, setting off a battle between the two groups of investors for control of the area and its rich natural resources. I interviewed Bonnie Sumner from the Aotearoa New Zealand news organization, Newsroom, who met with a man who, at the time of this interview, was listed as the majority shareholder of the concessions owned by Diggle Agri.
My name is Bonnie Sumner. I work with the Newsroom Investigates team. So newsroom.co.nz is a news organisation, online news site here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And our Investigates team, we do the in-depth investigation, so not daily news. We go probably do 6 really big stories a year.
One of those investigations was into the New Zealander in question.
So, this guy's called Neville Mann. He is what you'd call, he was a big hotshot kind of property developer in the 2000s. One of the sort of, linen shirt, boat shoe wearing kind of bigwigs that, did the big projects, so the big flashy stuff. So he started off, became quite well known for doing the Fiji, it was actually owned by the Hilton, but the Fiji Spa and Resort in Fiji. And it's quite complicated, but a lot of people ended up being owed money. He did those, he got into trouble with that, somehow managed to extricate himself from Fiji with, we think, some money. That ties into a company called Gleneagle Security, which is based in Australia. One of the directors at that time is a guy known as Nithan Thiru, and he is an associate of Neville Mann's, and it is believed that he got some money out of that, got into Gleneagle Security, and then he and Nithan Thiru were able to somehow, a relationship was formed between the Rumangang family and Nithan Thiru and Neville Mann. So we think sometime around 2015, post-Fiji, post a few other failed developments, he went off to Jakarta and met Ventje Rumangang, who was the patriarch of the Rumengang family. He was one of the founders of the Democratic Party in Indonesia, and he had started this company called Deagle Agri, which is the owner of these 3 concessions as part of the Tanah Merah project.
David Williams of the Newsroom team detailed Neville Mann's complicated exodus from Jakarta in an article last year. Though it remains uncertain exactly how Neville Mann ended up transitioning his ventures into palm oil development, Newsroom states that his connection with Nithan Thiru through Gleneagle Security is when the switch occurred.
How Neville Mann went from developing these, property development to going into what he calls the resource sector, we're not completely sure, but there is some connection there, we think, with this guy, Nithan Thiru. And so that's when he kind of pivoted into this different area of deforestation and palm oil growth.
Mann is no longer allowed to enter Fiji, but the speculation is that he may have been able to exit the country with a nest egg of sorts. Whether or not this happened, or where the money has gone, isn't known for certain. However, Mann has stated that he has money tied up overseas, using this as a way to placate his currently ongoing bankruptcy proceedings. And he says this is one of the ways Newsroom knows about his involvement in the Tanah Merah project.
There's still court cases ongoing here to do with his developments, his failed developments. There's one to do with like a hotel in Auckland, some developments in Queenstown. He's just one of those guys that sort of, gets his fingers in all the pies and is, a bit of a mover and shaker, but so far we sort of haven't seen a whole lot of successful outcomes for him. So at the moment there are court cases going on. Not sure of the outcome yet, but I do know there are bankruptcy proceedings against him. He is saying the reason that we kind of know about his involvement in, one of the reasons we know about his involvement in Papua, and the Papua Tanah Merah project, is because he keeps saying that in his court cases that he has money tied up overseas in forestry, in timber, so he can't access anything, and he has funds available, but he can't access them right now. So he's trying to stave off bankruptcy proceedings by saying that he has these investments overseas.
However, the more obvious piece of information is that Newsroom was able to obtain official documents that listed Mann as a majority shareholder in the Deagle Agri concessions.
So there's certainly a trail of evidence that links him there, not least of all is the fact that he's on the shareholding documents from Indonesia itself. But it's interesting because when we did meet up with him, he was there was sort of dual realities going on. He really had different ideas about the facts, I think, than what we had.
Newsroom wanted to meet with Mann in person to ask about his involvement in the Tanah Merah project, but getting him to agree to a meeting proved to be a difficult task.
We've been trying to get him to talk with us, and we were very persistent, but it did take a very long time. And so in the meantime, we kind of grew a picture of what he was like, and we discovered that he had a weekly standing meet-up with a group of his associates, and he just seems to have a group of guys that he always meets up with. And so we didn't end up meeting up with him there, but we did obviously get some footage of him there. And in the end we did. It was a very long and involved process, but in the end we did get him to sit down with us after a complex sort of series of emails and phone calls. In the end, he met us at a cafe in Newmarket, which is kind of like an upmarket shopping district in Auckland. And it seemed like it was a regular cafe for him, like his local. He lives in a house around the corner from there that is not owned by him. So he claims that he has no assets in New Zealand. He has no bank account. He has no social media. He basically lives, he says, off his partner, Saren Lu's income, whatever she has, and through her family.
Melanie Reed, lead investigator of the Investigates team, and Bonnie Sumner were finally able to arrange a meeting to talk about 4 central accusations regarding his involvement. His answers to these were, at times, starkly different than what occurred in reality.
So we did get him to sit down with us finally, which was really exciting because we thought that he never would. And then we were able to put to him the questions that we had, and there were 4 really pertinent questions that we wanted him to answer around his involvement in the Tanah Merah project and Deagle Agri Group, which is the company that has the 3 concessions over there.
The first point was the fact that Mann was listed on official documentation as a majority shareholder. Mann flatly denied this, saying that his actual holding was around 1%, and that he was a temporary front for the company.
So the first one is that he has a majority shareholding in Deagle Agri Group. So we secured 4 copies of the shareholding from the Indonesian government at 4 different points in time. And they were all legitimate. So we acquired them through legitimate means. And in every single one of them, he had the majority shareholding. And so we put that to him, that he is a majority shareholder, and he just flatly denied it. Said that his family have a 7 to 8% shareholding in the company, and of that, his is probably 1%. He just denied it. So, and so did Jones, Room and Gang, who took over as one of the directors of the Deagle Agri Group when his father, Venture Room and Gang, died. And so he said the same thing in letters that they wrote to us. So Neville Mann would continue to try to deflect and get us to ask the questions of the group, of the company, so to email Jones, Room and Gang, so we did, because he stopped answering our questions after our meeting. Neville Mann did. So he just flatly denied it.
After I recorded this interview with Bonnie, she informed me that Newsroom Investigates was able to obtain updated documentation from Indonesia that shows Mann's name had been removed as a shareholder. The second point that Bonnie and Melanie posed to Mann was that the company had a vested interest in timber. Mann denied this as well, mischaracterizing the rainforest that would be cleared as scrub growth. Newsroom was able to confirm that Mann was slated to receive profits from timber that were worth millions of dollars.
And the second one was that the company obviously must have an interest in timber because they have to raise the rainforest in order to utilize, in order to grow the palm oil. So they must be doing something with the timber, and there's a huge industry around it in Papua, as we know. And he flatly denied that as well. He said he had no interest in the timber. He said it's not mahogany, it's scrub growth. They've got no interest in that whatsoever.
Newsroom was also able to obtain documentation in the form of court evidence after the publication of their story that directly conflicts with Mann's claims, and it's actually from Mann himself.
We've actually recently secured another piece of documentation that we've been wanting for quite some time. That also backs up that timber is a very big motivation for them and the money that they could make from that. We did cast a pretty wide net to try and secure this document, which did land post us doing the story. So it does essentially admit to everything that he's been up to, and it's from him. So it's his own evidence, court evidence. So the claim that he has no interest in timber, he literally said that we have no interest in the timber, is, again, reflective of this kind of dual reality that's going on, which is, I think, is quite fascinating to see play out in real time when you're talking to someone.
The third point raised was that the concessions Deagle Agri owned were primary rainforest. Despite evidence that shows that this is indeed the case, Mann denied this fact completely.
So that was a big point he made. He said it was utter rubbish that it was rainforest at all.
Mann instead claims that it was cleared out 35 years ago, and that it was all young growth, and that his partner and his children wouldn't even want to walk out the door if it was rainforest.
He said it was not virgin rainforest, that it was cleared the area that we're talking about. So each of these concessions is around about 40,000 hectares each. So they have a concession essentially in total of around 120,000 hectares, although they only actually have permission, as of the story, for 2 of those. So those are the 2 that they were working on, so about 80,000 hectares. He said that whole area, it was cleared out by, quote, the Malaysians 30 years ago, and so that it's all new growth, it's all young growth. This is heartily disputed by Greenpeace and others who have, other activists and other people who have been there on the ground. They say it's just not true. But he was pretty adamant that that was the case. Yeah. I mean, I will say, as a person, and, meeting him, he was pretty affable. He was quite believable. He was friendly. He didn't seem angry in any way or sort of aggressive. So it was really interesting because he was sitting there and he was adamant that these things are truths.
The fourth and final point was the purpose of these concessions. Mann claims the concessions were for agriculture, to grow food for citizens of Indonesia, even though the permits themselves, official government documentation, are for oil palm and timber, which both Newsroom and Greenpeace were able to obtain.
So the fourth was around what the land is going to be used for once the trees are all gone, which he was, again, adamant that it was to grow food for Indonesia. He said 70% of food in Indonesia is imported. There's 240 million people that need to be fed, and they're on the doorstep to Indonesia, and that they will be growing soybeans, rice, sorghum, cattle, other crops. But that's not what the evidence shows. So their permits are not for growing food. It's for growing oil palms, and it's for timber. So timber and oil palms are what the permits are for. And this was confirmed with the documentation that we secured. It was also confirmed with documentation that Greenpeace secured. Again, dual realities, yeah.
Perhaps just as confusing as his denials of the allegations raised, Mann seemed confused by the very fact that anyone in New Zealand would care what he's doing in Papua. Given the global context of climate change, biodiversity loss, and the human rights implications of taking Indigenous land for palm oil, I found it a bit surprising that he wouldn't realize people would know or care about this. Bonnie wasn't as shocked, noting that in her work she's interacted with other people who share what she describes as the same arrogance. Mann referred to the land on which the Tanah Merah project sits as the back end of nowhere.
I would like to say that I was surprised, but I think, as affable as he was, he's definitely a particular kind of person, and he's a kind of person that I've come across that kind of personality a little bit in the work that we do, where it's a kind of arrogance, basically. So, they have a certain level of arrogance that kind of just allows them to just go forth and say the things that they want to say. I think he had a bit of a vibe that it was back end of nowhere. Why should anyone care? It's not New Zealand, or it's not a Western country. So for him, it didn't seem to matter, which is interesting because he was, on the one hand, he was saying that, and on the other hand, he was saying, that if he was doing what we were accusing him of doing, his wife wouldn't let him walk in the door, his partner wouldn't let him walk through the door. So his partner, Sarah Lou, she used to do like natural baby foods, had a company doing that kind of thing. I think she's quite sort of environmentally minded. So I don't know how their relationship works, or what her understanding or what the family's understanding is of what he's doing, but there is definitely some incongruity there.
Neville Mann's associate at Diggle Agri, Jones Rumangang, claims that Diggle Agri was following NDPE, no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation policies, and that FPIC, free, prior, and informed consent processes were being followed with local and Indigenous communities in the Regency. But Greenpeace's Grant Roseman stated in a video interview with Newsroom that they aren't seeing any of that on the ground.
So first of all, NDPE stands for no deforestation, no peat, and no exploitation, and it's and my understanding is that it's something that companies and countries can sign up to, that it's a commitment to not to no deforestation and no burning of forests as well, and also to work with the local people to ensure that they have access to all, their way of life, essentially. My understanding is that Grant Rosamond from Greenpeace is who we spoke to, so he does a lot of their international forestry advocacy work. He basically said that despite Jones Rimmington writing in this email to us, in this letter to us, that they've signed up to that, they're committed to NDPE, he said that that's just not true, that's not what they're hearing on the ground.
As explained earlier in this episode, the Jokowi administration lifted its moratorium on new palm oil permits last year, leaving open the possibility for more permits to be granted. And consequently, in January of 2022, all of the original land leases for the original 7 concessions in the Tanah Merah project were cancelled, along with dozens of others. Regardless, none of this means that the land leases could not simply be reissued. No one knows for sure right now what will happen with the 7 concessions in the project.
In terms of where it could go from here, so Indonesian government officials at the district level, at the provincial level, at the central government level have all issued permits to companies who are holding concessions within this project. And, those officials could cancel those permits at any time. They might get hit with a lawsuit from some of these investors. But, if they canceled the permits based on, real irregularities in the way that they were issued, they could be justified in doing that. Another issue here is it's still unknown who actually controls much of this project, because the identity of the investors are hidden behind these anonymously owned shell companies in, places like Dubai. So one thing that can happen is the identities of those investors could come out. Whether it's via investigative journalism or whether it's via, the Indonesian government, because the Indonesian government has, in recent years, I think it was a few years ago, they created a new rule that all companies incorporated in Indonesia have to declare who their beneficial owners are. So they have to tell the government who their true owners are. If that was actually done, then it could reveal the owners of these concessions. We wrote about this a couple years ago. The Indonesian agency responsible for implementing this was having a really tough time getting information from the companies. It still seemed like it was a few years away for them to actually get the ownership information. So, in some cases, the Indonesian government doesn't even know who's behind these companies that hold permits to clear rainforest in Indonesia. So, if the identities of the owners come out, depending on who they are, it could galvanize maybe some more opposition to this project, put pressure on public officials to revoke the permits.
So far, combined with other companies involved with Tanah Merah, Diggle Agri has, and continues to, bulldoze land for oil palm. As of now, 9,000 hectares, 22,000 acres of land in Tanah Merah has been cleared, and it's estimated that 4,000 hectares, 10,000 acres of palm oil has reached maturity. Given the context of the lifting of the moratorium and the movement to expand the International Criminal Court to add ecocide to its list of crimes, Bonnie Sumner emphasized the importance of using on-the-ground sources of information and locals, rather than believing what companies say they do or what they say they plan to do.
The pressure is mounting, and I know from listening to your most recent podcast about the Trans-Papua Highway that the moratorium has been lifted. Making moves like that, like lifting moratoriums on no new palm oil plantations. At the same time, there is mounting pressure. I don't know if you saw that they're trying to add ecocide to the International Criminal Court alongside genocide and crimes against humanity. They want to add that as a crime that people can be charged with, which in this instance, if they did add that, what they're talking about is deforestation as one of those charges. So who knows where that will go. But in a time where this is what's happening, you're lifting moratoriums, you're trying to add ecocide, I think that it's important that we have people like Grant Rosamond making these statements and making sure that people are aware of exactly what's going on the ground. And it's not just him, but all the actual activists and the people who are like Frankie Samparate on the ground. These are the ones that are really risking a lot to get the word out about what the reality is like on the ground. So I think that's the thing we really need to do, is to listen to these people, and maybe not so much the developers and not so much the company owners, but really just the local people, and see what's really happening.
I mean, this project sits in the heart of the world's third largest rainforest. After the Amazon in South America, Congo in Africa, the rainforests of New Guinea, which exists between Indonesia and Papua New Guinea, that's the third largest rainforest in the world. It's the biggest rainforest in Asia. This project is at the heart of that rainforest. So the idea is to take this enormous tract of rainforest and turn it into a giant hole in the rainforest, and then plant oil palms on that hole. Or maybe Neville Mann, is planning on planting a different crop there, whatever it is. It's turned it into a giant agribusiness estate.
Aside from the human rights implications of taking land that belongs to Indigenous communities and locals, Grant Roseman has said that due to the immense amount of carbon that this Rhode Island-sized chunk of rainforest contains, raising parts of it would make it unlikely for the world to meet its climate change mitigation goals, and that protecting it is a matter for us all.
Consumerism is not going anywhere. People still want their decks, and they still want their, tables and all of that kind of stuff. So, and also palm oil products, obviously. These are resources that are worth billions of dollars. So, given that, and given Grant Roseman saying, if this rainforest is raised, we will not meet our targets to stay below 2 degrees. Definitely not 1.5. There are definitely more revelations to come, and there's definitely more work to be done in this area, obviously.
Thanks to Bonnie and Philip for contributing to this episode. Please be sure to listen to our next and final episode of the New Guinea season of Mongabay Explores. Make sure to listen to our previous 6 episodes, which explore the island's vast biodiversity and history, carbon credit schemes, illegal logging, ecotourism, the birds of paradise, tree kangaroos, and the Trans-Papua Highway. The podcast's introduction and soundscape are from the Adalbert Mountains in Papua New Guinea. Credit to the communities of Musiamunat, Ivera, and Irarame, the Nature Conservancy, and Zuzana Buravalova. Birds identified are listed in the show notes. Mongabay Explores is an ongoing podcast series diving into environmental stories from around the globe. If you enjoy this show, we ask that you please tell a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. Please subscribe to Mongabay Explores wherever you get podcasts, and don't forget to leave a review and let us know what you think. Special projects like this are made possible by our Patreon supporters, so please consider becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Even just $1 per month will really help us offset the production costs and hosting fees. Keep up with all of Mongabay's news from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or get updates via Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and also TikTok, where our handle is @Mongabay. Thank you once again, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Mongabay Explores.